Have you ever believed in something so deeply, so certainly, that you never questioned it, until one quiet moment shattered the illusion completely? It is strange how life works like that, how a belief we carry for decades can collapse in a single breath. And sometimes that collapse leads us somewhere we never imagined, somewhere like Davao, somewhere like the Philippines. For years, there has been a quiet whisper about countries like ours. You have heard it. I have heard it. A whisper that floats from conference rooms in Tokyo to business lounges in Singapore. A whisper spoken with polite smiles but sharp edges. The Philippines is too unstable, too unpredictable, too behind. They say it casually, as if the whole world agreed long ago, as if judgment had already been passed on a nation of more than 100 million souls. It is an old insult, soft, subtle, but persistent. A suggestion that Filipinos are good workers but not good leaders, that we are friendly but not strategic, that our kindness is a weakness. And for a long time, people like you and I simply sighed and tried to ignore it, because what else could we do? But then something happened. A micro shock. Quiet, almost invisible to the world. Somewhere in a private boardroom in Osaka, a Japanese billionaire, a man who had everything people spend their lives chasing, stood up from a meeting and walked out without saying a word. His directors were stunned. His assistants followed him all the way to the elevator, asking what was wrong. But he said nothing. Not a single word. He simply left. His name was Kenji Nakamura, a man whose face had appeared on magazine covers, whose speeches filled auditoriums, whose investments shaped cities, a man the Japanese media once called the quiet genius of Asia. And yet, in that moment, he felt small, invisible. That day, he realized that despite his wealth, despite his brilliance, he had been living under a shadow, an illusion built not just by society, but by himself. And that illusion was about to break. What if I told you that only months later, this same man, who had never looked at the Philippines twice, would find himself standing under the warm sun of Davao, overwhelmed by a feeling he could not explain? What if I told you that he would eventually say, "This is the first place in my life where I felt truly human"? But how does a Japanese billionaire, someone with power, resources, and comfort, end up on a journey toward a city many in his circle never bothered to understand? It began with a loss he didn't expect, a loss that hit deeper than business failures, deeper than financial setbacks, the loss of meaning. Kenji grew up in a world built on perfection. Japan's silent pressure shaped him. Work harder, sleep later, sacrifice more. There was pride in that, but also pain. His father had raised him with strict discipline, telling him that emotions were distractions and kindness made a man vulnerable. Kenji followed that path for decades, believing it was the only way. And by society's standards, he succeeded. But somewhere along the way, he forgot what it felt like to breathe without measuring each second. He forgot how to smile without calculating its purpose. When the board meeting ended that day, something inside him cracked. He realized he was admired but not loved, successful but not fulfilled, surrounded by people but deeply alone. And loneliness is heavy, even for the wealthy, even for the powerful, even for a billionaire. He stepped into his private car and whispered to his driver, "Take me anywhere, just away from here." That was the first time in years he had allowed his voice to tremble. The world saw him as a titan. But inside, he was a man quietly sinking. And then, almost by accident, the Philippines appeared on his horizon. Not as a plan, not as a strategy, but as a whisper of possibility. A whisper that would soon grow into a calling he could not ignore. He did not know where he was going when he left that building in Osaka. All he knew was that he needed distance, from the noise, from expectations, from the suffocating pressure to remain the unshakable genius everyone believed he was. But distance does not heal a wound unless we are brave enough to look at it. And for Kenji, the wound had been growing for years. A wound shaped by exhaustion, loneliness, and something even deeper, the slow decay of hope. It began with his health. For a man known for discipline, he hid a secret that would have shocked his admirers. A chronic illness, one he kept silent, one that Japanese doctors treated with cold efficiency but little compassion. Pills, scans, endless tests. Yet no one ever asked him how he was feeling as a human being. His body improved, but his spirit withered. Then came his mother's death, a grief he tried to swallow because society expected him to be strong. But grief, when denied, becomes poison. It seeped into his work, his sleep, his relationships, and the world around him, wrapped tightly in perfectionism and silent competition, gave him no space to breathe. He tried to escape the heaviness. First in New York, where he sought clarity through business seminars and high-profile therapy. But he found only more noise. Crowds rushing, money moving faster than hearts, people living in beautifully lit loneliness. He left after 3 weeks. Then he tried Switzerland, a clinic specializing in the mental fatigue of executives. Everything was immaculate, everything precise, yet everything felt cold. Healing cannot happen in a place where warmth is sterilized out of existence. He stayed 10 days. The doctor said he needed more time. Kenji told them he needed something they could not provide. His final attempt was London, where a private neurologist gave him a bleak warning. If you continue like this, your body will collapse long before your wealth does. It was not the fear of death that struck him. It was the realization that he had lived for decades without ever feeling truly alive. Hopelessness settled in. A quiet, disciplined kind of hopelessness. The kind that hides behind perfect suits and polished speeches. The kind people applaud without knowing they are applauding a man who is breaking. Yet life, in its strange mercy, sometimes opens a door where we least expect it. And for Kenji, that door appeared in the form of a young Filipino nurse named Angela, working part-time at the London clinic. She was not assigned to him. She had no idea who he was, but she noticed something the specialists overlooked. She noticed his silence, the heaviness in his eyes, the way he stared out the window as if searching for something he had lost long ago. One evening, while handing him his medication, she said softly, "Sir, sometimes the body heals only when the heart finally rests." He looked at her, startled. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with genuine care. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Davao," she answered, smiling. "A little far from here." That name, Davao, stayed with him long after she walked away. It repeated in his mind like a melody he couldn't place. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt something shift inside him. Not a solution, but a spark. The tiniest flicker of possibility. Over the next few days, he found himself seeking conversations with Angela. She told him about her hometown, not with exaggeration, but with warmth. She spoke of families eating together even when they had little, of laughter during storms, of neighbors who checked on one another without being asked, of a kind of life where humanity mattered more than perfection. And something in Kenji softened. He began to wonder if he had spent his life chasing excellence but missing meaning. If the answer he had searched for across continents existed not in the world's wealthiest cities, but in a place most billionaires never bothered to look at. Was it possible? Could the Philippines, this country he barely knew, hold what the world's most advanced societies had failed to offer? It felt impossible. And yet, for the first time in years, His heart whispered a question instead of a complaint. What if the path he needed had been waiting for him? The name stayed with him like a gentle echo. Davao. A word he had never spoken before somehow found its way into his thoughts when he woke, when he rested, when the world around him fell quiet. It wasn't the city itself that pulled him. He barely knew anything about it. But the way Angela said the word, soft, warm, as if the place itself held a heartbeat, as if it was a refuge. One night, unable to sleep, he searched for it. Not investment reports, not tourist articles, just simple stories from ordinary people. He watched a video of a fisherman laughing while repairing his net during a storm. He read about a teacher walking miles to bring books to children. He listened to the voice of a young priest speaking about hope with a sincerity Kenji had never heard from leaders in wealthier nations. By the time dawn broke in London, something became clear. He needed to go. He needed to see this place that seemed untouched by the coldness he had felt in every other corner of his life, not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but as a man searching for breath. When his plane descended over Davao for the first time, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Outside his window, the city appeared simple. No towering financial districts, no carefully orchestrated perfection. Yet it radiated something he had been craving without knowing how to name. A quiet sincerity. A sense that life here was not measured by speed or ambition, but by connection. As he stepped out of the airport, a warm gust of air wrapped around him, carrying the scent of sea salt and earth. A driver held a small sign with his name, but instead of the rigid formality he was used to, the man greeted him with a smile so natural it disarmed him. "Welcome po, Sir Kenji," he said, as if speaking to a long-time friend rather than a stranger. On the drive to his hotel, Kenji watched people going about their day, vendors arranging fruit with care, families gathering under trees for shade, children laughing as they chased one another across the sidewalk. Nothing felt forced, nothing felt manufactured. There was poverty, yes. There was chaos, noise, unpredictable traffic. But underneath all of that, there was something the world's richest cities had lost long ago: soul. He checked into a small boutique hotel, avoiding luxury intentionally. He wanted to be among people, not above them. That afternoon, he took a simple walk along Roxas Avenue. He expected to be anonymous, invisible like he often felt in foreign countries. But he wasn't. A vendor offered him a free sample of durian, laughing when he hesitated. A group of students asked where he was from, their curiosity innocent, not intrusive. An elderly woman selling sweet corn told him, "You look tired, Anak. Eat something good." He was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not in Tokyo, not in Zurich, not in Manhattan. There was no calculation, no hidden motive, just kindness. A nurse's smile in London had sparked something. But here, in Davao, the spark began to glow. Later that week, he visited a small community clinic, not because he needed treatment, but because he felt drawn to understand the people who lived within this constantly beating heart of compassion. A young doctor, seeing him waiting quietly, asked if he needed help. Kenji said no, he was simply observing. The doctor replied, "Here, we cannot always give much, but we always try to give love." It struck him deeply. He had spent billions trying to perfect systems, optimize efficiency, build empires of steel and glass. Yet this doctor, working with limited tools and worn chairs, had articulated a truth far more powerful than anything he had heard in corporate corridors. Love. That was the missing element. The element no country, no hospital, no therapist had been able to offer him. He felt a shift. Not dramatic, not sudden, but certain. a quiet realization that something in him had begun to heal the moment he stepped foot here. And as he walked out of the clinic into the golden Davao sunset, he sensed that this place was not merely comforting him. It was awakening him. The days that followed unfolded quietly, almost humbly, yet each one carried a weight he could not ignore. It began with small routines, morning walks along the coastline, short conversations with locals, simple meals eaten beside strangers who spoke to him as if he had always belonged. There was no fanfare, no spotlight, no reverence for his wealth or status, and oddly, that was what healed him most. For once, he was not a billionaire, not a public figure, not a man expected to perform strength. He was simply Kenji, a human being trying to feel whole again. One morning, as he walked past a small chapel, he heard singing. Not the operatic kind performed in grand cathedrals, but soft, unpolished voices, raw and real. Curiosity pulled him inside. There were only a handful of people, workers in uniforms, mothers with their children. A tricycle driver holding his cap respectfully in his hands. They were praying the morning devotion. Their eyes were closed, their faces serene. And for a moment, watching them, Kenji felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not the manufactured peace of expensive retreats. A peace that came from surrender, from trust, from faith that did not hide during hardship. He sat at the very back, unsure if he belonged. But no one looked at him strangely. No one questioned his presence. And when they prayed, "Give us strength," something inside him trembled. He realized he had never asked life for strength. Only control. Control had been his armor. But the people here were different. They did not hide their vulnerability. They embraced it. And somehow, that made them stronger than anything he had ever tried to become. Later that afternoon, he visited a modest barangay where Angela's family lived. They welcomed him without hesitation, even though they barely knew him. They cooked for him, prayed before the meal, and talked as though he were a relative returning after a long journey. At some point, as he watched them laugh around the small dining table, he found himself blinking away a warmth behind his eyes he had not felt since childhood. "Sir Kenji," Angela's mother said gently, "you don't need to be strong here. You just need to be yourself." For a man who had spent decades earning respect from the world, it was shocking to realize how deeply he longed for something far simpler. To be seen without expectation. The transformation deepened in the days that followed. He began helping at the community clinic, not as a donor, but as a volunteer. He carried boxes, served water to patients waiting in line, listened to stories that were filled with struggle yet spoken with smiles. He watched families facing illness together with courage that defied logic. There was hardship everywhere, yet despair never won. There was always a joke, a song, a prayer ready to rise from the ashes. One evening, after hours at the clinic, a child tugged at his sleeve. The girl, no more than 5, handed him a small handmade bracelet. "For you, Tito Kenji," she said. "Thank you for helping us." It was a simple string of beads, mismatched, uneven, but he held it as if it were made of gold. Because no award, no business achievement, no international recognition had ever given him the feeling that tiny bracelet did. It reminded him of what he had been missing all his life, a connection crafted not by wealth, but by sincerity. That night, alone in his room, he stared at the bracelet on his wrist and whispered into the silence, "I have never seen this anywhere else." The realization hit him deeply. The Philippines had restored not just his health, not just his hope, but something far more profound, his faith in humanity. Every day he stayed, he felt the weight in his chest lighten, the tension in his shoulders soften, the sharp edges of his life melt into something gentler. He no longer woke with dread. He no longer measured time by productivity. He began to understand that life was not a race to be won, but a journey to be lived, and that the people of Davao had somehow taught him this without even trying. He did not intend to stay. That was the surprising part. Davao was supposed to be a pause, a break from the chaos he carried inside. Yet every day seemed to weave a thread around him, threads of warmth, compassion, simplicity, until one morning he realized they had formed something he had not felt in decades: belonging. And belonging, he now understood, was the greatest wealth a human being could ever hope to find. He woke earlier than usual that day, not out of anxiety but out of a quiet eagerness to step back into the world outside. The sunlight filtered through the curtains with a softness he'd never noticed before, like an invitation rather than an obligation. As he stepped outside, children greeted him with cheerful waves. Vendors nodded at him with familiar smiles. And the tricycle drivers he had grown to know lifted their hands in warm recognition. In their eyes, he was not a billionaire. He was simply part of their morning. Later, he visited the chapel again, this time sitting not in the back, but somewhere in the middle, surrounded by worshippers whose prayers carried both burdens and hope. A woman began to cry silently during the service, and instinctively, without thinking, Kenji reached forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked at him with surprise, then gratitude. That single moment left him trembling. For years he had been the one needing comfort. Now he had become someone able to give it. Transformation does not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper, a shift so subtle that by the time you notice it, it has already changed the entire shape of your life. Kenji found himself walking slower, listening more deeply, smiling without calculation. He laughed with neighbors, joined community meals, and even learned a few Bisaya phrases that made everyone around him laugh affectionately at his attempts. And then came the moment that sealed everything. One evening, Angela's family invited him to a small gathering. The electricity flickered, as it often did, but no one seemed bothered. They lit candles and continued talking, laughing, eating. The flickering light cast warm shadows across their faces, and Kenji looked at them. These people who had welcomed him with nothing to gain, and he felt something swell inside him so powerfully he had to excuse himself for a moment. Outside, under the humid night sky, he let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. Tears formed uninvited. Not tears of sadness, tears of return. Tears of someone who had finally found a place where his soul could rest. When he returned to Japan briefly to settle business matters, his colleagues expected him to move on to his next conquest, Singapore, Dubai, Paris. But instead, he announced something that left the entire boardroom silent. "I'm moving to Davao." His executives blinked in confusion. Some thought it was a temporary break. Others questioned the decision. A few whispered that stress had changed him. But Kenji simply smiled, a smile they could not interpret. "For the first time in my life," he told them quietly, "I have found what success never gave me: peace, purpose, and people who see me as human." And with that, he walked out of the room, with the same steady calm he had once left it in despair. But this time, he was walking toward something, not away. When he returned to the Philippines for good, he brought with him not just investments, but a heart ready to live again. He donated anonymously to the community clinic, funded scholarships for local youth, and supported small businesses not for recognition, but because he understood now. Real growth begins with compassion. Real change begins with dignity. He often told friends who visited him, "The Philippines did not save me because it is perfect. It saved me because its people know how to love even in imperfection." And maybe that is what the world needs to understand. In a time filled with conflict, division, and cold ambition, the Philippines stands as a quiet reminder that humanity still exists, kindness still thrives, hope still breathes. So if you ever find yourself tired of the noise, exhausted by expectations, or searching for a place where your heart can finally slow down, remember this story. Remember that somewhere in the southern islands of a nation often underestimated, a Japanese billionaire found the one thing he never found anywhere else. Not wealth, not power, not success, but home.